All right, welcome back to another episode of Science of the Strike podcast, where we are trying to use science to understand the whys behind the sport of bass fishing. My name is Corbin Healy. I am joined with my co-host Sam Huckabee. You can find the podcast on all of the places where you would find a podcast on Apple, on Spotify. We have stuff on Instagram, on YouTube. We even have a TikTok page. Real quickly, we just want to plug our sponsors. First is B3 Custom Rods, coming out of the Kansas City area. A buddy of ours who has been making handmade custom rods that Sam and I absolutely would argue go toe-to-toe with some of the best stuff on the market. If you're interested in B3 Customs, you can find him on Instagram, or you can reach out to us at Science of the Strike on one of the social media platforms, and we can get you his contact information. And the next is Fishers of Men Custom Lure Company. Our buddy Cade, is custom painting anything hard bait that you can imagine. Any type of crankbait, any type of jerkbait, any type of topwater, any type of glide bait. He probably has it and can work with you to generate a custom color, pattern, anything like that. He'll even paint over baits that you might already have. So if you've got a glide that you really like, you can send it his way and he will paint it for you. So getting into the episode, this is episode 8, which is exciting. And in episode 8, we are kind of taking our first stab at looking at water quality. We've had lots of requests from viewers over the social media platforms asking about an episode of a variety of different water quality topics. And tonight we're going to kind of focus on 2 of those. I'm going to be focusing on dissolved oxygen levels, whereas Sam is going to be talking about turbidity levels, which plays into not only the water clarity, but the water quality in terms of the sediment level and the particulates that are in the lakes that we fish in, and how much of those particulates are in different areas might affect the fish. We totally plan on doing more episodes on water quality. For example, another one we get a lot of requests on is like pH levels. And so we want to dive into that as well. But tonight we're going to just focus on, I guess not necessarily tonight, depending on when you're listening to this. Could be morning or afternoon. Tonight for us, it will be dissolved oxygen and turbidity levels.
I will say this. When you guys are making your comments, we're seeing these, right? We're reading through all of these, and we're really trying to make sure and write down what you guys are saying. If you guys do have topics for us, and I've been doing some research, and I just want you to know some of the stuff that you guys are wanting us to study, there are no good studies out there for us to report on. So you have to keep that in mind when you're asking us these things. Some of these super nuanced things you might be asking us about, there may not be information out there yet that is studied well enough for us to want to bring to the table for you. Because we're trying our best to make sure we find the best information every time we bring something to the table for you guys. So I just want to throw that out there, that we are looking at all of your guys' information, that you're putting out there on our comments or whatever it may be, YouTube, Instagram, pages like that. And we are trying to do our best to, suit this podcast to you guys, our listeners, as best we can.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, we have a running Google Doc of close to 100 different topic ideas just for upcoming episodes that we've gotten from you guys. And actually, while we're talking about episodes, I forgot to mention, I cannot confirm or deny, but we might have some upcoming episodes that could potentially feature the tip of the spear when it comes to professional bass fishermen, in talking with these anglers about the scientific implications of a lot of the topics that we're talking about and how it affects their fishing and their understanding and experience on the water, and how that might compare or contrast to what we find on the scientific research that we're doing. So we'll see. Fingers crossed. We'll definitely keep everybody apprised to what's going on. All right. So dissolved oxygen is what I'm going to be talking about, and then I'll pass it over to Sam on turbidity. So I want to kind of first start off with understanding or going through kind of some definitions, and just so everybody's on the same page, because I didn't know any of this really until I researched it myself. So what is dissolved oxygen, right? Dissolved oxygen essentially is the measure, or it can be measured, of the molecular oxygen gas that is physically contained and dissolved within water. It might seem dumb to think of like H2O, that obviously oxygen is contained within the water, but there are differing qualities of oxygen depending on the time of year and the location of the lake and so on, and we'll get into that. Oxygen primarily enters the water through what's called atmospheric diffusion at the surface, and as a byproduct of, interestingly enough, photosynthesis from aquatic vegetation, whether it be grass or moss or algae or whatnot. And then that oxygen that is created in the lake is then transported throughout the entirety of the water column, no matter how deep your lake is. And that happens through physical processes like wind or currents, or even boat traffic can mix these differing levels of oxygen. Another thing that's important, or term to understand, is what's called stratification. Okay, and this kind of goes hand in hand with the term thermocline, which most of us have likely heard that term. Similar but slightly different. So let's talk about stratification first. So in lakes and reservoirs and bodies of water, dissolved oxygen concentrations are not uniform throughout the entirety of the lake. I know I talked about how they might mix, but the uniformity is never there. And what happens, and can happen and does happen, is that those oxygen levels stack onto each other almost like a pancake, like pancakes. Like they're in differing levels, almost like you would imagine like sediment levels, right? So for example, like a warmer, or which is like warmer water, which is less dense than cold water, also known as, scientifically called, the epilimnion, can become very rich in oxygen, while like a cooler, denser bottom layer, which is called a hypolimnion, can become what's called hypoxic, which is essentially oxygen depleted. And that can happen because of all different kinds of reasons. Now, shifting a little bit on the thermocline is essentially a super distinct layer within a body of water where that temperature changes more rapidly with depth than it does in the layers above or below it. So a great example of a thermocline, if you've ever swam in a lake and you're swimming in the summer and you're swimming there and maybe you go down, or your foot goes down a little too far, or you swim down a little bit, all of a sudden you'll feel that water get instantly colder, like at a very hard line, right? That essentially is the thermocline, all right? And it happens when a lake's surface, it's most noticeable in the summer, right? It happens when the lake's surface is heated by the sun, which creates that hyper density difference between the upper and lower levels of the lake, all right? Now, I could spend a lot of time on this, but one of the very classic terms that you'll hear as it relates to the thermocline is like the lake, quote, turning over or flipping. And essentially what happens is, like in the summertime, the top surface of the water gets very warm, and that warm water is less dense, so it rises to the top, and that all that water will stay up, that warm water will stay up at the top.
Makes sense.
Now, the lake turning over is when, as the water cools throughout the fall, eventually that surface layer will become close enough in temperature to the bottom layer where they will exchange places. Okay, so now you have all of that oxygen depleted water, which is at the bottom, exchanging places with all of the oxygen rich water in the surface. Okay, we can talk later about how that might implicate fishing strategies in the fall, and might explain why movement and feeding are oftentimes higher in the fall compared to the summer or winter. But let's get into, now that we kind of understand some of that language and kind of know where we're going, let's get into some of these studies, all right? So the first study is more of, I wanted to use because it tests and gets into kind of the biology and anatomy of a largemouth bass to understand their response to hypoxic water. So the title of this study is called the Physiological Response of Largemouth Bass to Acute Temperature and Oxygen Stressors, by a guy or an individual named M. Van Langdenham, I believe, from the Illinois Natural History Survey and Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Science at the University of Illinois. This was published in Fisheries Management and Ecology Journal in 2010.
Awesome.
So they ran a number of experiments on bass in tanks in a lab. All right. And their experimenting focused on two primary objectives. All right. The first was quantifying the physiological responses of resting largemouth bass after an acute temperature change and then after an acute oxygen change. Now, I could spend some time getting into how, I mean, they essentially shocked these fish with super cold water, super hot water, and watch their response. We're not going to talk about temperature tonight. We can maybe cite this study in future episodes if we want to do one on temperature. I really want to focus primarily on the dissolved oxygen. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not going to get into the like oxygen, the milligrams or the micrograms of dissolved oxygen in the water that they were using. But I do want to talk about the different blood and muscle samples that were used for indicators of stress in these fish. Okay. So it's wild what all they looked at. So the study looked at the bass plasma cortisol, which is obviously their primary stress hormone, plasma glucose, which is an indicator of metabolic activity and energy consumption, the plasma lactate I literally had to look up how you pronounce this.
Dehydrogenase?
You got it. There's the dentist coming to help. Yeah, or LDH, which is an enzyme that indicates tissue damage, right? They looked at the white muscle lactate, which is a byproduct of anaerobic metabolism, which can indicate like a lack of oxygen in the fish. They looked at white muscle phosphocreatine, which is pretty much an energy store, and then finally plasma sodium, potassium, and chloride, which are indicators of like a healthy ion balance in the fish's blood. So again, I'm going to skip through the temperature stuff as it relates to those results. So let's look at the oxygen shocks. Just like what they did with temperature, they put these fish through a huge variance of oxygen levels. They pumped them full of like hyper-saturated oxygen or oxygenated water. Then they did somewhere in the middle, and then they took all of the oxygen out of the water and they kind of tested everywhere in between. All right, so let's start off with what they called the hypoxic shock, all right, which is the low oxygen. And this is where the most significant physiological changes occurred. And they exposed these bass to this hypoxia, so low oxygen, for 6 hours. And when that happened, their plasma glucose and white muscle lactate concentrations increased and their plasma potassium decreased. All right, well, what does that mean? Okay, what that essentially means is that prolonged exposure to hypoxia creates a chronic stress reaction in the fish. It creates energy depletion, and it can disrupt that ion balance in them. Okay,
that's huge.
So yeah. So low oxygen. I mean, that might seem obvious, but it's something that we don't think about how
depth-wise.
Well, and we're going to get into that with more habitat selection stuff with another study. But it just I want the listener to know that like it is scientifically, objectively true that fish in water that have low oxygen levels are struggling and are not.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. They're more stressed out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, the other side of this is the hyperoxic shock, which was the high oxygen, and essentially they showed a very high tolerance to high oxygen levels, and no significant changes were observed. So the overall results pretty much indicate that wild bass can tolerate a very wide range of dissolved oxygen levels. A sustained exposure to lower oxygen levels is harmful and is bad and is not desired by the fish. So
Very good.
that seems obvious. But I want to shift over to well, actually, you know what? Before I shift over to I think the most interesting study, I wanted to talk very briefly about another study that I read that is similar, but it's just worth it's like kind of the last physiological part of this. And this study was titled "The Behavioral and Physiological Response of Largemouth Bass to Rain-Induced Reductions in Dissolved Oxygen in an Urban System," by a guy named Greg Galk, and this was published in the Transactions of American Fisheries Society journal in 2015. Long story short with this article, I don't want to dive too deep into it. The big kind of takeaway for me that was really interesting, I would have thought that like a rainstorm, that a rainfall would lead to increased oxygen levels in the water.
Especially breaking up the surface.
Exactly. I would have thought that. Now, this study was obviously done in the context of like urban systems, which a lot of our lakes are, where there's a lot of pollution, there's a lot of runoff into the water. It found that rain actually creates these hypoxic events for fish that contribute to lower oxygen levels overall in lakes.
Really?
So, yeah, isn't that interesting? These urban runoff areas, or they call them oxygen depleting substances, which are like pollutants or highly organic sediments.
So
very interesting.
People putting on their grass and lawns and
Stuff
running off into lakes. And
or you think about like, cars running on roads and like, gasoline and oil and all that stuff like leaking into the water that, contributes to that. Now, the last piece of this puzzle, which I don't think is super important, but it is interesting, is that this one of these bodies of water in Chicago that they tested, they actually found that some of the bass were kind of slowly adapting and evolving to survive in these like kind of hypoxic settings, right?
Sure.
I mean, if a bass can get away from an area with low oxygen, it's going to, but if forced to, like
required to live there,
exactly, like they are physiologically evolving to, I mean, they're adapting, which is interesting. So
maybe it's move slower, eat slower, I mean, you don't have the oxygen, you can't do the same kind of movements and stuff, that's for sure, just muscle wise.
So the really big study that I read, which is super, super interesting and really blew my mind, is a study called "The Behavior and Habitat Selection of Largemouth Bass in Response to Dynamic Environmental Variables with a Focus on Dissolved Oxygen," by a guy named Christopher French. This was his master's thesis to graduate from the College of the University of Illinois in 2016. All right, it was a 100-page thesis.
Jeez.
Yeah. So he dove deep into this. All right, so I'm going to try to use some of the language that he used just to come directly from him, because I think he worded it in a really simplistic way in some of these areas. So the purpose of this test from him says that understanding how fish interact with and respond to their environment is a critical part of fisheries research and management. My research investigates the effects that low dissolved oxygen concentrations and other dynamic environmental variables have on behaviors and distributions of largemouth bass, aka where are they at in the lake, right? So there were kind of three primary tests that he did. The first test, he observed foraging behaviors of juvenile bass in a lab setting in a simulated stratified environment. So remember how we talked about these layers of temperature and oxygen? He simulated that, and
he was able to do that.
He was able to do that, and I'll throw in some. He put in some drawings of how he did this. Really interesting how they were able to successfully do this. I mean, I won't get into it, but I'll put in some photos so the viewer can see. The second part of this test, which kind of goes hand in hand with the third, was that he tracked largemouth bass positions in a stratified lake in Illinois, and examined the oxygen and temperature selection along with the movements of the bass in relation to available abiotic habitat, aka like timber or grass or stuff like that. And then finally, he conducted an analysis to determine the effects and relative influence of multiple abiotic, biotic, and physical variables on the occurrence of largemouth bass. All right, so I'll explain kind of what that means when I get to tests 2 and 3. I want to break down this first test first, but tests 2 and 3 blew my mind. So let's go back to test 1, which is this foraging or eating in a lab setting in this
Stratified.
stratified,
Test tank.
water.
Yeah.
So what he did along with some of his assistants is he created a lab environment of that simulated stratified lake, which included a warm oxygenated layer, which is that epilimnion, and then a cool low oxygen bottom layer, which is that hypolimnion. And the juvenile bass were placed into these tanks, and they observed the bass's foraging behavior under differing a huge variety of different conditions.
Okay.
Some of those conditions include when the prey was available in both the top and bottom layers, only the top layer, only the bottom layer. And they also varied the oxygen concentration in the bottom layer and then the density of the prey in each of the top and bottom layers. Right.
Jeez.
So they're wanting to know not only are the bass wanting to go into the hypoxic water or the warm water, they're wanting to know, will they follow food into hypoxic water where, eating habitat, all that kind of stuff. So here are kind of the dumbed down results. As you might expect, bass significantly decreased their consumption and foraging time in that low oxygen or hypoxic bottom layer. Okay. In fact, the fish were over 4 times less likely to successfully capture prey at the lowest oxygen concentration compared to that saturated oxygen levels.
4 times?
4 times. And when the prey density, bait density was highest in that low oxygen zone, that bottom zone, the individual bass were more willing to venture into those conditions to forage. But, interesting caveat to that.
Okay.
When that would happen, the researchers observed a new behavior that they saw in bass, which was that the bass catching the prey in those lower oxygen water were bringing it up to the surface to consume it.
So they were just going to get it and get out.
Exactly. They were going down, grabbing that bait, and coming back up into that more richly oxygenated water to actually swallow it.
Yeah.
Right? They were just grabbing it and going. They also saw an increased gill flaring and what they call aquatic surface respiration when oxygen levels were low. I didn't know this was a thing. This is freaking crazy. But fish will literally breach out of the water when there are super depleted oxygen levels. I looked this up because I was so curious. I'm like, when we're out on the lake, what's the number one fish? Yeah, I think you might have muted yourself. Oh, wait.
Yeah, I'm back. You hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
I was saying, you see carp do that.
That's exactly what I was going to say, is I looked this up. I was like, why are carp jumping out of the water? And one of the primary reasons why carp jump out of the water is for oxygen levels, right? I mean, there are other reasons, but still interesting, okay? So we know that bass from this simulated test are significantly less willing to feed in low oxygen level areas of the water column. Okay, so unwilling that they'll actually grab their food and come up to more richly oxygenated areas. So now let's go to tests 2 and 3, which was tracking in a real life lake. All right, so researchers implanted, I think it was 18 or 19 largemouth bass with these acoustic tags. Right.
Okay.
And then they released them back into this lake.
So they could find them.
Yeah. The name of this lake was called Ridge Lake in Illinois. It is not a particularly big lake, and I think that its max depth was like 20 feet, maybe. It was not a super, super deep lake, right?
Okay.
And what they did in this lake is they hardwired a network of what are called hydrophones and different transmitters to continuously track the fish's three-dimensional movements. So longitude, latitude, in every
cool.
way. Yeah. And while they were doing this, at the same time, they collected data on environmental variables, which included dissolved oxygen, temperature profiles, prey density, bottom slope, the presence of wood, the presence of vegetation, right?
That's
So
incredible.
a myriad of different features. And here's what they were wanting to figure out, as every bass fisherman in the world wants to figure out, is where are the fish and why are they going there, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that's the most important thing to you.
That's it.
It's the most important thing to you is
Right.
where are the fish and why are they going there? Okay.
Yeah.
And when you're
Yeah.
out on the water, you're considering all of those things I just named: temperature, bait, the cover, depth, slope. You're considering all of that. Okay. Well, most people, including myself, are probably not considering oxygen, dissolved oxygen. All right. So let's talk about the results. So during the summer months, which this makes sense, the amount of suitable habitat for bass was significantly reduced. Okay, bass were pushed into a very small portion of the water column to avoid low oxygen depths
Yeah.
and high temperature surface. So this is kind of an interesting duality here of the fish
Right.
trying to become the most comfortable.
That makes sense.
So the bass were found to positively select for oxygen concentrations greater than what it's 6.0 milligrams per liter. That makes no difference to us.
That you can use that actually. There's some lakes like Table Rock Lake actually will put out its dissolved oxygen readings regularly, like hourly.
No way.
Yeah. Yeah. So actually, I was looking that up. I was on Table Rock this past weekend and I was trying to look at like water flow, to try to see when they're pulling water.
Yeah.
And like trying to look at like the dissolved oxygen content. I noticed it was right next to it. Now, I didn't know what I was really looking at because I was waiting on this episode to come through. But you can find dissolved oxygen on some of your bigger bodies of water.
Wow, how interesting. Well, okay. Well, here we go. I mean,
Yeah.
this study, this particular study talked about how they prefer oxygen concentrations greater than 6.0 milligrams per liter. Now, they also prefer water temperatures between 77 and 80 degrees. Okay, which I thought seemed warm
A little bit.
For what I would have
best
guessed.
they could find though when it's super hot. It depends on probably where you're at.
Yeah.
Where you're at, Illinois, is that right?
Yeah. So still interesting, but so like I said, these fish are kind of stuck in between this sandwich of I don't want to be too hot at the surface, but the oxygen is a little bit better at the surface. But I'd like to go down for the cooler water, but when I start getting too deep, I start running out of oxygen, right? And so you kind of get stuck in this middle thing, all right? Some individual bass out in the wild were frequently observed making brief trips into that hypoxic deep water, but they did not stay there, which again suggests that the low oxygen, it's not an absolute barrier to movement, but they would go in to feed and would come back out. Now, let's now talk about like the influential factors about where they were, all right? Now, the most influential physical variable was habitat type. All right. In this lake, the bass were more likely to be found near woody structures than they were around grass. Okay. But when you take all of those factors compared together, which is that third part of that test, temperature or water temperature, oxygen levels, water depth, cover, vegetation, slope, all of those things together, oxygen concentration was the most influential variable in predicting bass occurrence.
Really?
The number one thing. It was the number one. That and temperature was the number one thing in determining and predicting where the fish were going to be. Which is wild.
That's crazy. I will say this. When I was looking at those statistics on Table Rock's, USGA, whatever it is that putting out those water statistics for you.
Mhm.
When they were drawing the water, it seemed like there was some kind of positive correlation of dissolved oxygen going up. Now, I don't know if those are directly related, because the
Right.
water movement or what it was, but, people are always like, oh, the bass are going to bite better if they're pulling water. You've heard that. You look up, the statistics behind it. It's hard to find anything that's studied like super in-depth, studies like that.
Right.
But
Right.
dissolves oxygen, on the other hand.
Well, let me explain a
Yeah.
little bit of that based off of this study. And this is kind of one of the last things I'll get into, which is like the implications. Like, what does this mean for us? Like,
Right,
okay, cool. They like oxygen. Duh. Like who cares? Right. Like what does that mean to me? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, there's a few things, and it kind of depends on the time of year and what is going on in your body of water. All right. So the first thing is going to be like in the summertime, which we are now. And I can tell you right now, I've been out fishing the past several weeks. This is super true. I didn't realize really what was going on, but now I do. It's targeting what they call the Goldilocks zone, right? Which is that zone, which is just that perfect combination of temperature and oxygen. Now, where do you find that? Okay, that is often that narrow band that is just above the thermocline. Okay, that is just above that significant
Makes
switch.
sense.
Now, okay, so again, you're out on the water, you're going, well, still, where is that? Now, this is where having sonar is going to really play a big game for you. And I don't mean live sonar, I'm talking about traditional 2D sonar. Depending on your gain rates or the frequency that you're running in the summer or even in the winter, you can see static that will come across the middle of your graph that looks like a line. And that is the thermocline. That is the sonar being disrupted by that stratification. And so you can, when you get out on the water, maybe troll out into the deeper or deepest parts of your lake so you can establish where that thermocline is. All right, I'm out here, I'm looking at my graph, the thermocline is at 20 feet. So maybe where do I want to start? Let's start trying to find structure or different areas that might have bait in it that is right around that 15 to 20 foot range that is that perfect balance between warm enough water and highly oxygenated water.
Right.
Okay?
And just to remind the listeners, that thermocline is only going to show up when there's that drastic difference in water temperature. So your fall and your spring, it's going to turn over and that's not going to be there anymore. Right.
Right. Which, and this study, I mean, I didn't get into this, but that makes sense because, you look at the activity levels of fish in the spring and in the fall, which are usually going to be the greatest levels of activity because for a number of reasons, one of which is because the water is being churned and turned over where the oxygen levels are easier to access, are higher. What I should say is like greater oxygenated water is easier to access.
Yeah.
And you're not, and the fish aren't fighting that like super hot, surface layer, right?
Right.
And this going back to kind of what you were saying about Table Rock, about like, oh, like they're drawing water. You hear that that's better. Why is that? Well, I mentioned this a little bit in the beginning about how different things can cause that water to get oxygen in it, which is churning, right? So like I said, wind or current can cause that water to constantly be grabbing water from the top and pulling it down, and so it doesn't surprise me that
there's some correlation there.
Yeah, there's absolute correlation to that. So I think one of the big takeaways here, though, too, and we've been kind of alluding to things like this throughout our other episodes, is like, don't necessarily solely rely on prey, right? Like, don't necessarily just focus on, hey, where's the bait? Because fish are 4 times less likely to go after food if it's in areas where they can't get oxygenated water. And so you need to try to consider being in good water, right?
And I don't know this for sure, and you may have read a little bit about this, but obviously bass need more oxygen to survive than anything like a bluegill or a gizzard shad or something like that. So is it kind of safe to assume that they can survive longer in those deeper waters, or did you read anything on that?
Sam, that's a great question, and I didn't read anything on that, so I don't want to assume that.
Yeah.
But you do have these studies talking about how there are
Right.
presence of bait
In those areas.
in inaccessible areas.
Okay.
So
So
take
yeah.
that for whatever you will. I
Yeah.
didn't read anything on it. I'm sure
Okay.
there's literature out there on it, but I just didn't read it.
Okay.
So kind of the very last thing I want to talk about is, so if you're listening to this, we've touched on 3 of the 4 seasons, right? We've touched on summer, and then we've kind of explained how the lake turning over in the spring and the fall can lead to maybe a more populated or higher oxygenated lake overall.
Yeah.
What about winter, right? You don't really think about oxygen levels in the wintertime because everything's so cold. But it's worth just mentioning very briefly. So during the winter, oxygen levels can be low kind of throughout the whole water column due to a limited replenishment, especially if your lake like freezes over. But the deepest water, which is also the densest, tends to hold more oxygen than the shallow surfaces just under or near like the surface. Oftentimes that might have ice, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, I guess shout out to all of our ice
Northern
fishermen
guys.
who
Yeah.
might be listening.
That's right.
You know, what this suggests is that bass will likely be in that deeper, more stable water where oxygen is most plentiful, just above the lake bottom. And so, again, when you're out there on the water, depending on the time of year, you need to consider all different types of variables, right? I mean, every single variable that you can. I mean, obviously, guys don't want to overcomplicate things, but Sam and I like to. So,
That's the truth.
so here's signs of the strike, you know. But the big takeaway I think from my stuff is that when you get out on the water, especially when you're in summertime fishing, one of your primary considerations needs to be dissolved oxygen levels, and trying to figure out where you can find that, whether that be you being able to read on sonar, hey, here's the thermocline at this depth, let's target this depth. Or if you don't have sonar, or if you're on the bank, trying to think, hey, where is water running? Is there some type of current that I can get into near a channel? Is there water flow that's coming in from a creek, you know, to promote that more richly oxygenated water? Because that is the most important thing when it comes to predicting where the bass are going to be, above all else.
That's crazy.
I know, it's crazy. It's crazy. So
Oxygen.
I know.
Who would have thought?
Who would have thought that being able to breathe mattered, right?
Exactly right.
Yeah. So that's all I got, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right, guys, keep this short and sweet on my side. We're going to talk about turbidity a little bit tonight, or whenever you're watching this. It's turbidity is basically floating sediment in the water, so it's basically about water quality, you know, the ability to see and that kind of water. We alluded to vision in episode 1, which covers part of this in like color and stuff like that. But I'm not going to talk anything about color today. I'm going to talk about more about how different turbidity levels can affect what bass are eating and like what they're willing to prey on, and things of that nature. Just basically all about foraging for bass, kind of and kind of like Corbin said, you know, dissolved oxygen, it puts them in certain areas. It's somewhat similar. It changes their mood, how turbidity can affect them. So to start, I'm just going to tell you where this came from. This study was published in the North American Journal of Fisheries Management. It was done at Oklahoma State University, and the study is called Effects of Turbidity on Prey Selection and Foraging Return of Adult Largemouth Bass in Reservoirs. So this study was done in 2015, and this was really the first well-done study that looked at turbidity levels outside of a lab experiment.
Okay. All right.
So there has been quite a few turbidity studies done, and they alluded to all of these within their synopsis of their study, you know, of how different studies showed different results, and how their studies, they found some similar, you know, some not similar, but they were the first ones to really look at like real live application of turbidity levels of like the surrounding lakes. So let's see here. So to break down how the study was done, they were on lab trials and then a field study. So in the lab trials, they looked at the nephelometric turbidity unit. So it's called NTUs. And if you can find that and look that up about your lake, that can help you just be more precise with what you're looking at, kind of like Corbin said with the dissolved oxygen levels. But I tried to look this up, and it's really only readily available that I could find for like your Great Lakes and like really, really highly studied and like managed lakes. So
Oh,
maybe
wow.
some Texas, fisheries and wildlife might have something like that, because I know how well like they're
Yeah.
managed and taken care of
Yeah.
down there
California.
in California
Yeah.
potentially. So it depends on where you are if you're going to be able to find that. But just for you to be able to maybe take this into a little bit more of application, I looked up a way to like calculate like water clarity to like turbidity. So if you have like over 2.5 foot of clarity, that's going to be somewhere around 10 NTUs or nephelometric turbidity units.
Okay.
So just keep that in mind as I'm talking throughout the study. 10 or less turbidity units, is going to be where you could have 2.5 foot or more visibility.
Okay. All right. I got you.
So anything under 10, you're going to have some visibility past 2.5 feet.
Okay.
What they looked at was they did a clear swimming pool for their lab studies. It was a fairly large pool. They separated these bass. They used like 12 to 20 bass, I think, depending on, which study they were doing at the time. And they used bluegill and gizzard shad for their prey types.
Okay.
And they found that, just to start, that their prey selection between the bluegill and the gizzard did not differ between like gizzard or bluegill. It more changed on the amounts that they ate depending on the turbidity levels of what they were put in.
So in other words, the turbidity did not influence a preference between
exactly
bluegill or shad consumption, but it did influence overall fish consumption.
Exactly right. Great way to say that. So in the field study, they looked at 3 lakes in Oklahoma. It's called Boomer, Sooner, and Guthrie Lakes. I mean, what do you know,
nice.
Right?
How Oklahoma of them.
Some great names right there. I mean, couldn't nice. Be better. I love it. So they collected largemouth over a period of 2 years and then performed a stomach content analysis on these bass over these 2 years that they studied these lakes. Okay, so what are the numbers that they're finding, and how do they affect us? What do they mean? So the most straightforward finding from the lab was that increased turbidity directly led to decreased foraging success.
Okay, sure.
Okay.
All
so
right.
You think murkier water, obviously bass is going to have a harder time eating. Okay.
Sure. That would make sense.
So that's pretty obvious among, like anglers understand that, like bass are very visual feeders. Okay. So in one of their study, they found that in clear water, this is in their tanks, 100% of the bass they tested captured their prey. Okay. So in like
clear water.
In like the clearest water you can find, right? Like tap water.
Yeah. Okay.
Basically, so your northern lakes that have 25 foot of visibility, and some of those, like
or
this
more.
is kind of or more. This is you right here.
Okay.
And then, but once that turbidity was cranked up to 25 NTUs, which is pretty muddy, like a foot or less of visibility, like some rivers.
If you're saying that 2.5 feet is 10,
right. So they jumped it all the way up to 25 NTUs. They also jumped it up to 10 at one point. But 10, for the information they had on 10, is that they ate like 1 prey out of like the 6 prey that they put in there for like 10. So it considerably dropped, considering they didn't say like numbers, but they said every bass ate one. 1 of the 6 bass ate the prey and like 10 turbidity units.
Okay.
When they cranked it all up to 25, they were saying a huge drop and success rates plummeted to less than 15% for all the bass. So it was like a considerable difference between like when that turbidity range shoots up, say huge rainfall, whatever it could be, super windy, cloudy, just a bunch of movement in the water causing that sediment to rise or whatever, is going to cause that, or like a flood or something like that. Like these bass are going to have a really, really hard time eating the prey, obviously, chasing down their prey. Because they're doing this in a pool that's like 3 foot, by 3 foot, it's like the bass is like right next to it and it's still not eating it. Right. So, I mean, it's pretty alarming to like how clear like or like how necessary it is like for the turbidity levels to be low for those bass to have great success preying on bluegill or shad
Yeah.
type
Well, I mean,
type
they're
baits.
primarily visual predators.
Right.
You know.
So let's see. So the prey selection. Okay, so this perhaps was the most important finding for us anglers. In the clear water lab trials, bass showed a clear preference for certain prey, but as turbidity increased, that preference changed. And this is what I found
Oh.
fairly interesting. They switched from actively pursuing fast-moving fish like gizzard shad to diet that included more opportunistic, slower-moving prey like crayfish or bugs or thing that move along the bottom.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense, but
So
I've never thought of it that way.
right. You would just think maybe throw something, with some little more movement, maybe like a bigger, swim bait, something that's going to
Yeah.
have a little more drawing power, maybe something along those lines. But no, when those fish can't see, they're going to feed less opportunistically because of the energy depletion it takes them to chase down a 10-inch gizzard shad.
That is so interesting. And I mean, you think about super muddy water, and like my brain automatically goes towards like what are moving baits. So like I'm thinking of like a big spinner bait or like a big
Yep.
chatter bait or a big
Yep.
square bait. Now that in my mind is like to more trigger the lateral line,
Yeah,
which go
exactly
check out
right.
episode 4 or 5.
Yeah.
But it sounds like if you can find a way to trigger that lateral line perhaps while promoting a more opportunistic meal, then that's the way to go.
Yeah. Yeah. So I thought that was like super important for like me going to fish Truman Lake, this
Oh my
weekend,
God,
where
yeah.
Truman gets like dirtier than it, and like
Chocolate milk.
and like Grand Lake, in Oklahoma, like where
Yeah.
they're finding some of this stuff, like that lake gets so dirty and
Yeah.
like the turbidity levels get so high, when you go out and you are trying to, target fish, however, on forward facing sonar or whatever, you're throwing a shad or,
Right.
a minnow, and you're like,
Right.
this is tough. You got to put it right on their nose. You may think, like, hey, they might be, opportunistically, preying on crawfish or whatever it may be that may be moving slowly along the bottom. They can use their lateral line a little better, pinpoint something on the bottom a little easier to feed on than a big swim bait or a big bluegill or shad. So it's kind of that was some interesting information I found.
It's super interesting, and like I think it goes to the core of like why we do this, which is like helping understand why, right?
Yeah.
Like I mean that I never would have thought that, like that's so interesting.
Yeah. So you just think like a big rain or something that hits your lake real hard and you got to go out and fish a tournament the next day or whatever. Like you're going to rely on maybe those slower bottom moving baits, that, because those bass might hug to, structure or whatever when the water gets murked up, and those lower levels, dissolved oxygen content, might be not as good in rains, they're not going to be moving around as much. I mean, there's so much that's playing into this for this episode, but yeah, I thought that was really cool. So I will say this, field versus lab kind of thing. One of the most interesting nuances of this study was the difference between the lab and the field data. In the lab, they saw a clear decline in consumption rates as turbidity increased. But in the real world, in the 3 Oklahoma lakes, the researchers found no direct correlation between turbidity and the amount of food in the bass's stomachs. Okay. They were still eating very well.
Still eating
in their respective lakes, partially because they've evolved to be able to do this in whatever turbidity level they're in. Okay. But now the question is, why is that? And the scientists made, a stab at this of like why they think that could be. And they said, the research suggest that in a real lake, bass have options. They can move to clear water areas like near springs or where a creek might be running in very clear, that and they can also switch to food sources to try something that's more readily available or easier to catch in murking conditions like crayfish. So while they were foraging, their success on a particular prey might drop, they can adapt and still find enough to eat of other organisms.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So what that tells me, it's I guess obvious now that you've explained it to us, but like I mean, that turbidity level, that clarity level,
Yeah.
that current level even really has significant implications on not only, well, just the whole class of bait that you might be picking up.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. No,
that
exactly
I mean,
right.
I think that could be applicable probably across different areas of the lake. And like, I mean, this is such a great example. I mean, we've experienced this just on our home lakes. I mean, how frequently, like the home lake that Sam and I fish on a lot is like broken up between like an east and a west, right? That is
Yeah.
connected between two channels. And how frequently do we go from one to the other? And commonly are we like, wow, the water over here is way dingier than it is over there. And all the time. We come from tournaments off of this lake and we hear guys saying, "Hey, on West was killing them on a jig, and on
Yeah.
East I was killing them on a
That's so
crankbait."
true. I didn't
And
even
I
think about that.
couldn't get bit on the West Lake on the crankbait, and I got bit. Just like, and
Right.
I mean, there's so many different variables that go into that. I'm not saying that turbidity is the single part of it, but that, I mean, based off of those studies, it is a definite significant piece of that puzzle. I mean,
Oh yeah,
it's
for sure.
yeah. I mean, it's never ending. The search is never ending, but I think just understanding the why behind it is invaluable. I mean,
Yeah. Something else they said, for like application wise, they didn't dive into this too much, but they kind of alluded to this a little bit. Like when that turbidity rises to like when clarity is, a foot, 2.5 foot, and you're thinking maybe I should, or it gets into that 4 foot range where it's not clear, but like bass may be doing, maybe eating on shad, like they're gonna always be eating on shad, but like should you maybe pick up a crawfish style bait, or something along the bottom, a worm or something, like slow down your presentation. Like
absolutely.
those bass are
Absolutely.
not going to feed at the same speed without having their
Oh,
keen
God.
visual senses.
Yes. Oh my gosh. It's not only the lure that you're throwing, but it's the way in which you're presenting it too.
Right. And
That
it
speed
seems
thing
so
is,
obvious, but
yeah,
it's just
it
like
does.
you got to have someone say it. Like
I totally agree.
It's just the
Like, I
way it
totally
is.
agree. Yeah, like, I mean, you kind of say it out loud, and part of you go like, "Duh," but then you also
Yeah.
think like, "I've never really like put this together."
Right.
That's so interesting. Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Yeah,
And
like-
I am the worst at that. Like, how easy am I? Like, it's so easy to. You want to pick up a spinner bait, or you pick up a chatterbait, or pick up whatever moving bait, and you throw it out, and I mean, you're just
Yes, you
freaking
got that same line.
locked. You're
Yep.
locked on that same line all day, and you're just like,
Right.
I'm putting this down. I'm not getting a bite.
Yeah, you're like, I'll mix my tip in there a little bit, to
Yeah.
give it a little bit of erratic action, but
Yeah.
like, yeah, but that's what they're saying is like when it gets to that, dirtier water, picking up maybe like that rattling crankbait, but reeling it slow.
Right.
And reeling it along
Right.
the bottom.
Right.
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 Like making sure you're
Right.
making bottom contact.
Right.
Because that is lateral line. That helps with their vision not being as great. It's a little bit slower movement, and like, but like, I just have been so locked into, when we went to Texas, and it was like grind the crankbait as fast as you can, but that's when you're on a school of like 30 or 50 of them.
Right.
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 They're like competing. Like you're not throwing it out and maybe coming across the fish every once in a while if you're running the bank.
Right. Right.
So
Right.
it's different, and you got to continuously remind yourself and be, have that intent, like that what you're trying to focus on, that day or whatever.
I know.
It's just so hard. It's so easy to just go out there and just fish. And
I know.
sometimes it's good. Sometimes it's good to do. Like
Absolutely.
I'm not bashing that out. Sometimes you just got to get on the lake and just fish.
I know.
But if you're in a tournament setting, you're trying to figure things out before a tournament. These are some things to keep in mind.
I know. We're 8 episodes deep into this now, and I've just been thinking about this lately about how like future or like upcoming tournament strategies. I mean, like you could like with all of this information. I mean, if you have
Draw a
listened
tournament
to,
outline.
I mean, no, like Sam, like you actually could, like you could truly like get this so narrowed down to like, I mean, you could have such a game plan. Now, I mean, you can't guarantee that it's going to work. I mean, you're trying to beat a living creature, right? Like, but
they're gonna move.
Understanding this,
They might not be hungry.
Yeah, understanding this is, I mean, it's huge. And I had never thought about the speed thing as it relates to clarity or turbidity. And also just a plug for episode 1, because we did talk a little bit more about like turbidity in terms of like visual stuff,
like color,
and color.
Much more.
Yes. So
like
check that out
tying
as well.
these two episodes together, I feel like can be very helpful. And I find myself going back and watching some of our episodes. I'm like, man, what did Corbin say when he was talking about that? I'm going out in a situation like that,
I
because
do the same
you're
thing.
doing the research, for your side, and I'm doing the research for my side. So it's
Yes.
like I'm hearing this for the first time, and for you to really lock in something, unless you're going to go out and apply it tomorrow. Sometimes you got to hear it a few times. And so, yeah, I know this has been good stuff. I've really enjoyed doing this.
No, me too. Anything else on episode 8 for you?
I think that's good. I feel like we dropped some good stuff tonight.
No, for sure. I mean, I did not know any of that stuff before we talked about it. So.
Yeah. Dissolved oxygen was really cool. I'm going to try to focus on that when I go to places and just see if I can pull it up. Because, I mean, that's something that's more readily accessible. And, Table Rock, when I was looking at it, it was like somewhere between the 4 to 6 range. You were saying 6 is like ideal.
6 and above, yeah.
Right? So it wasn't getting to 6 very often at Table Rock. And I don't know if the Table Rock has some oxygen depletion or, what's going on there,
Well, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, depending on where the water is coming from, though. Yeah. Right? Because a lot of times, like dams that are dispersing water out is water that's coming from the very bottom of the lake, which is that super hypoxic water. Yeah. Right now, the flow is going to contribute to like a swirl that would help bring the highly oxygenated surface water down. Right. But that water at the very, and I don't know why I thought that the very bottom of the lake was like the most oxygen rich. I just like assumed. I was just like, oh yeah, it's the cold. The fish are going to be at the deepest part of the lake because that's just where they want. Like, absolutely not. Like, that is not true. I don't know why I thought that, but
we just need more boats on the water, stirring up the water.
Yeah, exactly.
We need some more wake boats out there, preferably. They do really
jet
good
skis.
job.
It really helps the fishing for sure. Some people tend to think that it does. So, yeah, they're in our comments.
Somebody in our comments said hover a helicopter over it and it'll be better.
Yeah, absolutely. All righty. Well, thanks so much for listening to episode 8. Again, we appreciate all the comments and the feedback that we can get. If you have any ideas or if you have any questions, please let us know. We always want to tell people if you have any questions about where we're getting this information, please let us know. We'd be happy to send this information your way so you can take a look at it yourself. So thanks again. We appreciate it, and we'll catch you next time on episode 9. See you guys.